The rain had already begun by the time I reached the lake. It wasn't the heavy kind that sends you running for cover, but the soft, steady kind that hums quietly over rooftops and whispers to the trees. It was the kind of rain I used to love most, the kind that made everything feel alive, as if the whole world were breathing. I parked the car at the end of the gravel drive and sat for a while, watching the drops slide down the windshield. Beyond the blur of gray and green stood the old cottage. The paint had faded to the color of ash, the porch leaned a little, and the windows looked cloudy with dust. Still, it felt like it had been waiting for me. When I stepped out, the air smelled of wet pine and earth, and beneath it all, the faint sweetness of the lake. I hadn't smelled that in decades. It stopped me where I stood. For a moment I was 15 again, barefoot, holding a fishing pole too big for my hands, calling out across the water to someone who always answered. The boards of the porch gave beneath my shoes. My fingers found the railing, smooth in places, splintered in others. The swing was still there, hanging by one chain, swaying lightly in the wind. The sight of it filled me with an ache that wasn't quite sadness, but something quieter, something like gratitude that it had survived it all. Inside, the cottage was dim. The air was cool and still. The shelves by the door still held my mother's old books, their spines faded and curling. On the mantel sat the small porcelain boy with his fishing pole, his hat chipped to the brim, his painted smile unchanged. Dust covered everything, yet nothing felt abandoned. It was as if the years had only paused, waiting for someone to press play again. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch that faced the lake. The rain made soft circles on the water. The willow by the shore leaned lower than I remembered, its branches brushing the surface like old fingers tracing a memory. That was where I first saw him. Thomas. He was standing on the opposite dock, his hair damp from swimming, his grin easy and sure. He must have been 16 then, maybe 17. I'd seen him every summer, but that year was different. That year, when our eyes met across the lake, something shifted inside me, something I didn't yet understand. Now, standing in the same place, I could almost see him still. His reflection in the ripples, the way he'd wave without saying a word, the sound of his laugh carried by the wind. I whispered his name before I could stop myself. It felt warm on my tongue, familiar in a way that made me both ache and smile. I pulled one of the old rocking chairs closer to the railing and sat down. The air was cool and smelled like wet leaves. From this spot, I could see the whole lake. The curve of the far shore, the shape of the boathouse my father built the summer before I turned 10. He built it by hand, piece by piece, humming the same tune every evening as the light faded. I used to sit on the steps with a jar of lemonade, watching him work, pretending I was his helper. After my parents passed, I stopped coming here. Life filled itself with other things, school, work, a city apartment, a husband, children. The cottage became part of another world, one that belonged to memory more than to me. And yet, when I close my eyes now, I can feel it all as clearly as the chair beneath me. The hum of cicadas in the trees, the smell of fresh rain on cedar, my mother calling through the screen door for me to come dry off before dinner. And always, Thomas, waiting across the water, where the light met the rain. The years have a strange way of folding in on themselves. One moment I'm here, gray-haired and slow-moving. The next I'm that girl again, standing at the water's edge with her heart wide open to the world. I came back to this place not to chase ghosts, though maybe I am, but to listen. To sit with the rain again and let it tell me what it remembers. Because I think the rain holds on to things we forget. It carries the sound of our laughter, the shape of our voices, the scent of places that made us who we are. They say time takes everything, but I've learned that isn't quite true. Time doesn't erase, it softens. It folds things gently into the corners of our hearts until one day, a sound or smell calls them back to us. And for a moment, we are both then and now. The rain is still falling as I sit here, slow and patient, as if it knows how much I need its company. I think of all the summers the first watched it from this same porch, wondering about the world beyond the trees, dreaming of growing up, of falling in love, of living a big life. And somehow, I did all those things. But nothing ever felt quite like this place. The quiet after a storm, the sound of drops on the roof, the shimmer of the lake in the gray light. I lean back in the chair and close my eyes. The rain feels like a heartbeat against the world. It whispers in the trees and dances on the water, and I can almost hear voices in it, soft, distant, familiar. I think maybe the rain remembers everything, and maybe that's why I came back. There's a certain smell that belongs only to this place. I noticed it the moment I stepped outside that morning. The mingling of rain-soaked pine needles, damp wood, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers growing near the porch steps. Even after all these years, I would have known it anywhere. It's the scent of my childhood, of long afternoons that stretched without hurry, of summers that seemed like they would never end. Back then, when the rain came, I'd sit right here on these same porch steps with my knees drawn up under my chin and watch the water gather in little streams along the dirt path. My father would be out there, wearing his old work hat, hammering something together even as the sky poured down. He never seemed to mind getting wet. He used to say that rain made the world honest, that it washed away the noise and left only what mattered. My mother, on the other hand, saw rain as a reason to make something warm. She'd start a pot of coffee or stew, humming quietly as she moved around the kitchen. I can still hear the soft clinking of her spoon against the pot and smell the mix of rain and rosemary drifting through the open door. She'd call out, "Ellie, don't catch cold out there," and I'd shout back, "I'm fine," even though I was already soaked through. I used to believe the rain had its own kind of memory, that it remembered where it had fallen before, that maybe a drop landing on my hand had once touched the same porch years earlier. Even now, as I sit here, older and slower, I find myself wondering if some of this very rain once soaked into the hem of my dress when I was 15, waiting for Thomas by the lake. He lived across the water, in a cabin his grandfather built long before either of us were born. His family came every summer like ours. I can still see the trail of smoke from their chimney, curling through the trees. Thomas was tall and sun-browned, with eyes the color of that strange green-blue light that ripples across the lake just before the sun sets. We met by accident, or maybe by fate, the way children do when the world feels simple and new. It was one of those first damp mornings of June. I'd wandered down to the dock, pretending to fish but mostly watching the rain slide off the edges of my pole. Across the water, I saw him, sitting with his feet dangling over the side of his own dock, tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks. He waved. I waved back. That was all it took. By afternoon, we were skipping stones side by side. He told me he was 17 and that he wanted to be a writer someday. I told him I wanted to travel, to see every place that smelled different than hay. He laughed and said the world might smell different, but it probably wouldn't feel better. I didn't understand what he meant then. Now I do. We spent nearly every day together that summer. Some days, we rowed out on the lake until the oars cut smooth silver trails behind us. Other days, we just talked, about nothing, really, about songs we liked, the people we wanted to become, the small things we feared. But what I remember most are the quiet moments, the ones where we didn't talk at all. We'd sit under the willow tree as the rain fell softly around us, the air thick with the scent of pine and wet grass. He'd draw circles in the mud with a stick while I picked clovers from the edge of the dock. There was something holy about that silence, though I wouldn't have called it that at 15. It was simply enough to be there, together, in that place the rain had touched 1,000 times before. I sometimes wonder what it is about certain memories that stay so vivid, while others fade like fog. I can't recall the exact color of my first apartment, or what song played at my wedding reception, but I can still smell that pine and see the shimmer of the lake through the rain. I can still hear Thomas's voice, low, kind, certain, when he said, "Don't forget this, Ellie. One day, when you're old, you'll need to remember." And I have. I've remembered every drop. Now, sitting on this same porch, the air thick with the same scent, I close my eyes and breathe it in. The years fall away like leaves from a tree. For a moment, I'm back there again, a girl in a damp dress, rain clinging to her eyelashes, heart full of something too big for words. It's strange, the way life circles back. I came here thinking I was chasing a memory, but maybe it was chasing me all along. Maybe the rain was calling me home, reminding me that not all things we leave behind are lost. Some simply wait. The clouds are lighter now. The rain is thinning to a mist. Across the lake, I can just make out the faint outline of the old cabin through the trees. It's barely standing, but it's still there, like everything else from that summer, worn but unbroken. I sit a little longer, letting the smell of rain and pine fill my lungs. Somewhere deep inside, I feel something loosen, a knot of time, gently undone. The world feels quiet again, honest again, the way my father said it would after rain. And for the first time in a long time, I feel at peace. I can still see him, that first clear morning after the rain finally stopped. The air was washed clean, the lake so still it looked like a mirror laid flat between the pines. The whole world felt new, as if the storm had taken every bit of dust and worry with it. I walked down to the dock barefoot, the boards still damp and cool beneath my feet. And there he was, the boy from across the water. He was sitting on the end of the dock, his knees drawn up, a notebook balanced across them. A fishing pole rested idly beside him, line slack in the water. When he looked up and saw me, he smiled. Not the shy, uncertain kind of smile most boys gave, but one that felt steady, like sunlight after a long storm. "You again," he said. "Me again," I answered. That became our rhythm. Small exchanges, easy smiles, hours spent where the day stretched long and kind. He told me his name was Thomas Everett. His family had been coming to the lake since before he was born, same as mine. His grandfather had built their cabin with his own hands. "It still creaks in all the same places," he said proudly, "but it's home." We talked about everything and nothing, the kind of talk that doesn't need purpose. He asked if I ever wondered what the world looked like beyond these hills. I said I dreamed about it all the time. He said he didn't. "Everything I've ever needed is right here," he told me, glancing out across the lake. Even the quiet. It made me laugh then. I was 15 and restless. I wanted cities and lights and strangers who didn't know my name. I didn't yet understand how rare peace could be, how hard it would one day be to find a silence like that again. The first time he took me rowing, I thought we might tip over before we even left the dock. He was tall, all elbows and good intentions, trying to show me how to hold the oars. "You've got to let them move with you," he said, his hands close over mine. "Don't fight the water. It'll carry you if you let it." We rowed to the middle of the lake where the sky was perfectly reflected below us. It was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. He stopped rowing then and just let the boat drift. The air smelled of pine and sun-warmed water. I remember him closing his eyes, saying quietly, "This is the kind of moment you should remember, even if you don't know why." I didn't say anything. I was afraid if I spoke, it might break whatever spell the world was under. So we just drifted there, surrounded by the sound of nothing at all, only the soft lap of water against the boat, the whisper of wind in the trees. That afternoon, when I went back home, my mother asked if I'd had a good time. I said yes, but she must have seen something different in my face, because she gave me a small smile and said, "You've got that look, Ellie." "What look?" "The one that means you've met someone who'll matter to you." I tried to deny it, but she just laughed, a knowing, gentle laugh, and handed me a towel for my damp hair. "You'll see," she said. "Some people stay with you even when they're gone." At 15, I didn't believe in forever. But now, sitting here decades later, I think maybe she was right. There's a strange thing that happens when you remember someone you loved as a child. The edges of them stay soft. Their laughter, their kindness, the way sunlight seemed to follow them. The details fade, but the feeling doesn't. It waits somewhere deep, unchanged by time. I can still remember the way Thomas would look out at the horizon as if he could see something no one else could. He told me once he liked the lake best just after a storm. That's when it remembers it's alive, he said. That's when everything wakes up again. And he was right. The rain had a way of bringing everything closer. The colors, the sounds, even us. Maybe that's why those days stayed so clear in my mind. They weren't just memories. They were moments that seemed to belong to something larger. Something that held both the storm and the calm after it. We spent that whole summer in a kind of quiet rhythm. Mornings by the dock, afternoons exploring the woods, evenings sitting by the fire as fireflies blinked in the tall grass. There was never any need to say too much. Every word between us carried weight, the way only summer words can when you're young and the world feels endless. One evening, as the sun sank low and turned the lake to gold, Thomas said, "Promise me something." "What's that?" "When you leave this place, when life pulls you away, promise you'll come back, even if it's just once, so you don't forget how it feels to belong somewhere." I promised him. Of course I did. I was 15 and thought promises were forever. Now, as I sit here with the scent of pine still lingering in the air and the echo of his voice folded somewhere deep inside me, I realize I kept that promise, even if it took a lifetime to return. Some memories don't fade. They simply wait for you to be ready to remember them. Those days seemed to stretch longer than any others in my life. Morning light spilled through the curtains like honey, and the air carried the smell of wet grass and sun-warmed wood. Time moved slower at the lake, or maybe we just paid closer attention to it. Every day began the same way. I'd wander down the hill with my shoes in my hand, feeling the dew cling to my ankles, and find Thomas already there, sitting cross-legged on the dock. He always brought something. A book, a jar of minnows, a bag of biscuits his mother baked that morning. He'd look up, grin, and say, "You're late." "I'm right on time," I'd reply, and would fall into laughter that belonged only to us. That easy, unthinking kind that comes from knowing someone by heart. The days had a rhythm, the rowboat creaking as we drifted past the reeds, the plunk of pebbles skipping across the water, the call of loons echoing from across the lake. Sometimes we'd talk about our futures. Other times we'd just sit in silence, listening to the wind comb through the trees. Thomas liked to say that the world was a great storyteller if you knew how to listen. Every ripple's a sentence, he once said, tracing his finger across the water. Every breeze is a whisper that remembers something. Back then, I didn't quite understand him. But now, after all these years, I think maybe he was teaching me how to see, how to notice the small miracles that most people rush past. One afternoon, the clouds rolled low and heavy, and the air turned thick with the promise of another storm. Instead of running inside, we stayed out on the dock, watching the sky darken over the hills. The first drops began to fall, soft as fingertips. Thomas turned to me with that steady, fearless look. "You ever notice how rain sounds different on the lake?" he asked. "It's softer, like the water's catching its own tears." We sat there, soaked through, laughing until our ribs hurt, until the whole sky cracked open and the world blurred into a sheet of silver. It was the kind of wild, pure moment that only youth allows, when the future doesn't yet weigh on you, and you can believe that everything you love will last forever. Afterward, we raced back up the hill, breathless and dripping, our clothes clinging to our skin. My mother scolded us lightly, handed us towels, and told us we'd catch our death of cold. But her smile gave her away. She knew that kind of happiness was worth the chill. Later that evening, we sat by the fire, wrapped in quilts, steam rising from mugs of cocoa. Thomas hummed a tune, one his father used to play on an old harmonica. I didn't recognize it then, but I can still hum it now. It sounded like home before I even knew what home meant. As night fell, the air filled with the hum of crickets, and the lake smoothed itself back into stillness. The rain had passed again, leaving behind that sweet, damp scent, earth and pine and something like memory. I remember thinking that summer would never end, that every day would be a soft repetition of light and laughter and quiet understanding. But summers, no matter how golden, are never endless. In the distance, I could hear a train whistle echo through the valley, low, mournful, beautiful. It carried a strange ache with it, like a reminder that time was still moving, even here. Thomas must have heard it too. He looked toward the sound, his expression distant. "My father says we might not come up here next year," he said after a while. "He's been offered work in the city. Better pay." My heart sank before I could stop it. "But you love it, hey?" "I do," he said softly. "That's why I'm telling you now. So I don't forget to say goodbye when the time comes." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him that some places hold on to us, that maybe he could come back even if life took him away. But I didn't have the words. So instead, I just reached out and took his hand. We sat like that, fingers intertwined, as the fire crackled low and the night deepened around us. That moment, the hush between us, the warmth of his hand, the quiet hum of the lake, has stayed with me all my life. I didn't know then that love could exist in silence, that sometimes the truest goodbyes are the ones you never say aloud. When I think back on that summer, it isn't the grand moments I remember. It's the small ones, the shared laughter, the smell of rain on the dock, the way the morning light always seemed to find us. Those were the days by the lake, days that still live somewhere inside me, undisturbed by time. It was one of those afternoons that didn't seem meant for remembering, the kind that slips by quietly, unnoticed, until years later you find yourself missing it without knowing why. The sun hung heavy and kind above the trees, and the lake shimmered like it was made of glass. Cicadas droned lazily in the distance, their song like the rhythm of the heat itself. My mother was shelling peas on the porch, the radio playing something slow and crackly in the background. The world, for once, seemed to have nowhere else to be. Thomas came by just after lunch, his shirt half untucked, a shadow of lake water still drying in his hair. "Thought we could walk down to the old bridge," he said. "There's a breeze down there." So we did. The path wound through a patch of tall grass and goldenrod, and every step sent up tiny clouds of dust that sparkled in the sunlight. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The comfort of being near each other said enough. When we reached the bridge, an old wooden one that crossed a narrow stream, we sat on the edge and let our feet dangle in the cool water. The world around us seemed to hold its breath. "Do you ever think about what you'll do when you're older?" he asked. "All the time," I said, "though I don't think I have the right kind of dreams for the real world." He smiled faintly. "What kind are those?" "The ones that smell like lilacs and sound like rain," I said, and he laughed. That easy, golden laugh that always made me feel like the world was still full of good things. He told me he wanted to be a writer someday, or maybe a teacher. "Something that lets me stay close to quiet places," he said. "Cities move too fast. They forget to listen." We stayed there until the shadows grew longer and the air cooled enough to raise goosebumps on our arms. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, and the sound carried across the fields. It was such an ordinary sound, one I'd heard every summer of my life. Yet that day, it felt different. I remember thinking that nothing truly ordinary ever stays ordinary. It's only when you lose it that you realize how sacred it was. When the light began to fade, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He said, handing it to me. I wrote something. It was a poem, short, simple, written in his careful, slanted handwriting. It read, "The lake keeps its secrets softly, and the wind carries names we forgot. Someday, when the world feels too loud, come back here, and the quiet will remember you." I didn't know what to say. I just sat there, the paper trembling a little in my hand, the words soaking into me like sunlight into wood. "Do you ever think memories can feel us remembering them?" I asked quietly. He tilted his head, thoughtful. "Maybe that's what keeps them alive." The walk home was slow. The air was full of the smell of pine needles and the faint sweetness of clover. The first stars were beginning to appear, shy and pale. Somewhere behind us, the stream murmured its endless song. When we reached the porch, my mother was still there, rocking gently, her bowl of peas now empty. She smiled when she saw us and said, "You two look like you've been talking to ghosts." "In a way," Thomas said, and she just laughed softly, the way only mothers do when they see a truth they won't say aloud. After he left, I sat out there for a long time. The night deepened slowly, the kind that settles in layers, frog song, fireflies, the faint hum of a faraway train. The poem was still in my hand, and I remember whispering the last line under my breath. "The quiet will remember you." I didn't know then that he'd be right, that the quiet, and the lake, and the rain would remember far longer than either of us could imagine. That afternoon became one of those memories that live in the corner of your heart, soft, untouched, and always waiting. It wasn't grand. It wasn't eventful, but it was whole. And in the end, that's what made it eternal. The summer was beginning to lean toward August when my mother pulled an old camera from the kitchen drawer. It was her father's, a square, boxy thing with a leather strap worn smooth from years of use. "Let's take some pictures before the summer slips away," she said, handing it to me. I remember the way it felt in my hands, heavier than I expected, real in a way few things are now. The world back then was slower, deliberate. You didn't snap 100 photos. You took one, maybe two, and you meant them. Thomas and I spent the afternoon wandering the edge of the lake, trying to capture something worth keeping. He teased me for taking pictures of shadows, ripples, and clouds. "You've got a funny way of looking at the world," he said. "Maybe I'm trying to remember the parts people forget," I told him. He thought about that for a while. "Then make sure you remember me that way too," he said with a grin. I did. When the light turned soft and gold, I told him to stand by the dock. He leaned against the post, hair tousled, shirt untucked, sunlight catching in his eyes. He wasn't posing. Not really. He just was, in that quiet, easy way of his. I lifted the camera, held my breath, and pressed the shutter. That click, that single, small sound, somehow caught more than a moment. It caught a whole season, a whole feeling. Afterward, we sat on the dock, letting our feet dangle in the water. He told me about the city his father might move to. Tall buildings, crowds, trains that ran all night. I tried to imagine him there, but I couldn't. He belonged to open skies and still water. "I'll write to you," he said. "If we go. I'll write back," I promised. It felt simple, certain, the kind of promise only young hearts believe can't be broken. That evening, my mother helped me hang the roll of film to dry in the kitchen. I remember the smell of the chemicals, the soft orange light. She held one of the wet prints up to the lamp and said, "That boy's got kind eyes." I nodded, too shy to say what I was thinking, that his eyes held something more than kindness. They held stillness, a kind of quiet strength, like the lake itself. The next morning, I tucked one of the photographs into my journal. The edges were still a little damp. I didn't show it to Thomas. I wanted to keep that one just for me. The way the light touched his face, the faint smile that said he already knew more about goodbye than I did. That photograph stayed with me long after everything else changed. It moved with me from one home to another, folded between the pages of that same summer journal. Years later, when I found it again, yellowed and bent, it still carried the scent of pine and lake water, faint but real. I realized then that photographs don't just capture faces. They catch air, sunlight, the sound of laughter, even the space between words. They hold time itself, and time, once held, never truly lets go. Sometimes, late at night, I still imagine that scene. The lake quiet, the dock stretching into the water, and Thomas standing there in that golden light, half boy, half memory. And I think, maybe he's still there, in some way. Maybe we all are, frozen in the gentle places our hearts refuse to forget. It's strange how a single photograph can become a doorway. Every time I looked at it, I could step back into that moment, barefoot on the dock, sunlight on my hair, the world still wide and unwritten. Back then, I didn't understand that photographs weren't for holding onto people. They were for holding onto the feeling of having known them. Years would pass before I'd see that truth clearly. But for now, the photograph was enough, a small, fragile proof that something beautiful had once been real. The summer had grown quieter by then. The laughter of children on the shoreline had thinned, the wildflowers along the road were turning brittle and pale, and the evenings came a little sooner each day. Even the lake seemed to know it. Its surface calmer, its reflections longer, softer. Thomas and I spent our days differently now. There was a new weight to our silences, not heavy, just aware. We both knew something was changing, though neither of us wanted to name it. One afternoon, he showed up carrying a small wooden box. He said he'd made it himself from an old pine board his grandfather had once used to mend their dock. "It's not perfect," he said, brushing sawdust from his shirt, "but it's honest." Inside, there were a few small things, a pebble shaped like a heart, a broken compass, and a tiny folded piece of paper. "What's that?" I asked. He smiled, that quiet, knowing smile of his. "A promise," he said. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was a little uneven, the ink smudged at the corners. It read, "No matter where I go, the lake will find me. If you ever come back, listen for the wind. That's where I'll be." It wasn't poetry, not exactly, but it felt truer than any poem I'd ever read. "You really think the wind carries things like that?" I asked softly. "I do," he said. "My grandfather used to say the wind remembers everything. Voices, laughter, even promises. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it." I placed the note back in the box, tracing my fingers over the grain of the wood. "Then I'll listen," I whispered. For a while, we just sat there, the two of us on the end of the dock, the water brushing gently against the posts beneath our feet. I remember the smell of pine needles baking in the sun, the soft buzz of dragonflies, and somewhere far off, the hum of an outboard motor fading into the distance. It felt like the whole world had slowed down just for us, to make room for that moment. Then Thomas said, almost to himself, "I don't want to forget any of this." "You won't," I said. He looked at me then, really looked, and I could see the mix of hope and sorrow in his eyes. "That's the thing, though," he said quietly. "We forget even when we don't mean to." I didn't have an answer, so I reached out and took his hand. His palm was warm, calloused from rowing, but steady. "Then I'll remember for both of us," I said. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The sky above the hills had turned the soft color of apricots, and the air held that golden stillness that comes only at the end of summer days. Finally, he stood, brushing off his jeans. "If I could freeze time," he said, half smiling, "it'd be now." I wanted to tell him that maybe, in some way, we just had, that memories were their own kind of timekeeping, soft but unbreakable. But I didn't. I just watched as he walked back toward the path, the box still in my hands, the light folding around him like a last goodbye the world didn't want to give. Later that evening, I wrote in my journal, "He gave me a promise today. It feels like holding sunlight." I tucked the box beneath my bed that night, beside the photograph I'd taken of him. I didn't know then that it would become one of the few things I'd carry with me for the rest of my life, across years, miles, and storms of my own making. Promises made in youth have a way of outliving everything else. They live not in the words themselves, but in the quiet certainty that, somewhere out there, another heart once meant them. And sometimes, that's enough to keep them alive forever. It was a Saturday near the end of August. One of those days that begins like any other and ends as something you carry for the rest of your life. The morning was bright and still, the kind of day that made the lake look endless. I remember standing by the porch steps, holding a mug of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the light play across the water. Everything looked the same dock, the same lazy drift of clouds, yet somehow, it felt different, heavier. Thomas didn't come by that morning. At first, I thought he was just running late. But by noon, when I hadn't seen him, a small knot began to tighten in my chest. I tried to ignore it, read a book, helped my mother hang laundry, picked wildflowers by the path. But the air felt restless, charged, like it was holding its breath. Then, just after lunch, I saw his father's truck pull up to their cabin across the cove. The sound of the engine broke the stillness, followed by the sharp slam of a door. His mother was standing on the porch, a letter clutched in her hand. Even from across the water, I could see it, the way her shoulders slumped, the way she pressed a hand to her mouth. I didn't know what the letter said. I just knew, deep down, that whatever it was, it had changed everything. By evening, the news had reached us. Thomas's father had accepted the job in the city. They'd be leaving before the week was out. No long goodbyes, no drawn-out farewells, just a sudden, clean break, as if summer itself had decided to close its doors early. I walked down to the dock, the light already fading, the water turned to glass. My reflection wavered beside the reflection of the sky, half light, half shadow. I don't remember deciding to go. My feet just carried me toward his cabin. He was there, sitting on the steps, a duffel bag at his side. He looked up when he saw me, and I could tell he'd been trying not to cry. "They said we have to leave tomorrow," he said quietly. I sat beside him, not trusting my voice. The air between us was full of all the things we didn't know how to say. "I thought we had more time," I finally whispered. "So did I." He handed me something, a folded piece of paper, soft at the edges. "It's the last page of my notebook," he said. I didn't want to leave it empty. I unfolded it, and in his careful handwriting were the words, "If we ever forget what the rain sounded like, meet me by the water when it falls again." That's where beginnings hide. It wasn't goodbye. It was something gentler, a promise wrapped in hope, the kind you whisper when you're too young to understand how permanent distance can be. We sat there until the light turned blue and the crickets began their evening song. He reached for my hand, and I let him. No words, no explanations, just that small, fragile bridge between what had been and what would never quite be again. When he stood, the wind picked up, a soft gust that rippled across the lake, bending the tall grass, carrying the scent of rain. "Guess the weather's keeping its promise," he said, looking toward the horizon where dark clouds gathered. I wanted to tell him to stay, to fight the change somehow, but something in me knew that wasn't the way life worked. The world keeps turning, no matter how much we wish it would pause. That night, the rain came, a steady, gentle rain that tapped against the roof like a heartbeat. I lay awake listening, wondering if he could hear it too from across the cove, wondering if he was listening for me. The next morning, the truck was gone. The dock was empty. The lake was still. I stood there a long time, the air cool against my skin, the world hushed except for the soft patter of rain. And for the first time that summer, I understood that sometimes endings don't arrive with thunder or tears. They arrive quietly, like a morning after rain, when you realize the air smells different, and nothing will ever be quite the same again. It had been 27 years since I last saw the lake. In that time, life had rolled forward in its quiet, unstoppable way. Seasons changing, people drifting, years folding over one another until memory became something you visited like an old photograph. But one evening, as summer tipped gently into autumn, something inside me whispered that it was time to go back. The road hadn't changed much. The same winding turns, the same tall pines brushing against the sky. Every few miles, I caught glimpses of things I half remembered. The rusted sign for the bait shop, the narrow wooden bridge that still creaked under the weight of passing cars. Each familiar sight stirred something warm and bittersweet, like hearing the first notes of a forgotten song. When I finally turned onto the gravel road that led to the lake, the air grew softer, almost shy. The dust rose behind my tires, the smell of pine and water reaching through the open window. And then, suddenly, there it was, the shimmer of light through trees, the stillness of water waiting below the hill. The lake looked smaller now, though maybe it was just me who had grown. The cottages were older, their paint weathered to the color of memories. The dock leaned slightly to one side, the boards faded silver gray. And the porch, my grandmother's porch, still stood, its swing gently swaying in the late afternoon breeze. I parked and just sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, heart caught between then and now. Walking down to the water, I could almost see it all again. The echo of laughter, the shimmer of two bicycles leaning against the fence, the sound of a boy's voice calling from the dock. Time hadn't erased it. It had only softened the edges. I found the old bench near the shore, the one Thomas and I had carved our initials into. The letters were still there, faint but stubborn. I traced them with my fingers, feeling the grooves, and for a moment, the years between us vanished. There was no one else around. The air was still except for the distant call of a loon and the quiet lap of water against the shore. I sat there for a long time, watching the ripples, letting the peace of the place settle into me. It felt strange, being back, not painful, but tender, like reopening a book you once loved. I realized I hadn't come here looking for answers or to chase the ghosts of what was lost. I had come because the place itself remembered. The rain, the trees, the boards beneath my feet. They carried pieces of us, the way the world always carries those who once loved it deeply. As dusk began to fall, I wandered up to the porch. The air was cool and golden. I found the key where it had always been, tucked behind the loose board under the rail. The door creaked open with the same familiar sigh. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. There were still a few of my grandmother's things on the mantel, an old clock that no longer ticked, a jar of lake stones, a faded photograph of her and my grandfather on the porch. I stood there, running a hand over the frame, thinking of how many evenings this house had held. I unpacked little, just a change of clothes, a book, and a candle. As night settled in, I lit it and sat by the window, watching the lake disappear into the dark. The stars came out one by one, shy at first, then steady. It wasn't long before I heard it, the soft whisper of rain on the roof. It started gently, like a memory returning. I closed my eyes and listened, the rhythm sinking deep into me. Each drop felt familiar, as though it had traveled all those years just to find me again. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something inside me ease, the kind of peace that doesn't come from forgetting, but from finally remembering without pain. Maybe that was what coming home truly meant. Not reclaiming what was gone, but honoring what remained. When I stepped out onto the porch, the rain shimmered in the glow of the light above the door. The lake was a sheet of silver, trembling softly. I stood there barefoot, letting the cool air brush against my skin. And somewhere in the distance, almost too faint to be real, I thought I heard it, a laugh I used to know, echoing across the water. For a moment, I almost answered. But instead, I smiled, let the sound fade into the night, and whispered, "I'm home." Morning came softly. I woke to the hush that follows rain, the kind of silence that feels alive, filled with the scent of wet pine and the faint ripple of water along the shore. The light was pale and gold, slipping through the curtains in gentle stripes. For a long while, I just lay there, listening. It's strange how a house remembers. Every creak, every whisper of the floorboard seemed to carry a voice, a trace of laughter, a word half-spoken long ago. The air itself seemed to hold the warmth of all the summers that had ever passed through here. I made a cup of coffee the way my grandmother used to, strong and slow, the way it fills the room before you even take a sip. The kettle's hum felt like company. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she used to shell peas or fold letters, and looked out over the lake. The water was calm again. Mist hovered low, turning the world soft and silver. And that's when I heard it. A faint hum at first, so soft I thought it might have been the wind. But it carried a rhythm, a familiarity that tugged at something deep. I stepped outside onto the porch, coffee in hand, and waited. There it was again. A voice. Not clear, not loud, just a breath of sound carried across the lake. It wasn't a word I could make out, just a tone, like the start of a name. My heart stilled in my chest. I knew that sound. I'd heard it 1,000 times in my life. Thomas. I closed my eyes and let the air settle around me. For a moment, the line between past and present wavered, like two images slightly out of focus, one fading into the other. I could almost see him, standing at the edge of the dock, sunlight on his shoulders, calling for me to come down, to hurry before the rain came in. The air was cool against my face, but my chest felt warm. Maybe it was just the echo of memory, looping back through time. Or maybe, in some quiet way the world doesn't explain, voices never really leave the places they once loved. The day stretched slow and golden. I spent the morning walking along the shore, past the old boathouse, past the fallen oak we used to climb. Each step seemed to release a little more of the past, like I was letting it breathe again. I found an old tin pail buried in sand, its paint chipped away. I laughed when I realized it was ours. We used to use it for skipping stones and catching minnows. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and felt the small tremor of recognition, the way objects carry us back, even when we think we've moved on. By afternoon, the mist had lifted and the lake shimmered under the sun. I sat on the dock, feet dangling in the water. The ripples glimmered against my skin, the same as they always had. Nothing had changed, not really. I thought about all the years I'd spent moving from one place to another, cities, jobs, people, always chasing something new. Yet here, in this quiet corner of the world, everything I had ever needed had been waiting all along. It's funny how love lingers, not in photographs or grand gestures, but in the smallest things, the sound of the wind through the reeds, the way the light hits the water at 4 o'clock, the soft echo of a voice that refuses to fade. That evening, I lit a small lantern and set it on the porch rail. The glow reached out toward the lake, trembling faintly in the breeze. I found myself speaking aloud, softly, not to anyone in particular, just words I hadn't said in years, words of thanks, apology, and something close to prayer. And when I stopped, I thought I heard it again, the faintest whisper, not from the air or the water, but from within. Not a ghost, not sorrow, just memory, answering back. As darkness deepened, the lake seemed to listen too. The stars gathered above it like the reflection of every moment I had ever loved. I realized then that echoes don't fade. They just find new ways to reach us. And maybe, when you truly listen, what you hear isn't the past calling out to you, but your own heart, remembering how to be still again. That night, I fell asleep with the windows open, the air cool and full of crickets. I dreamed of nothing, only light, water, and a voice that no longer felt far away. The days began to find their rhythm again. Morning light spilling across the porch. The soft scrape of a chair pulled closer to the window. The sigh of the lake as it woke. It was strange, how easily I slipped back into the pace of this place, as if the years between had been nothing but a long breath. I'd wake with the dawn, walk down to the dock, and watch the water catch fire under the rising sun. Some mornings, fog would curl across the surface like smoke, and the whole world would feel like a dream half remembered. Autumn came first, slow and quiet, the way goodbyes should be. The maples turned first, deep gold, then red, then a tired brown. The air began to smell of wood smoke and pine. I found myself wearing sweaters that still carried the faint scent of old drawers and cedar. The nights grew longer, but not lonelier. There was a comfort in the stillness. I started keeping a small journal, just a few words each day. Not about big things, but about the light, the sound of rain, the way the wind brushed through the reeds. I think I wanted to remember the quiet moments, the ones I used to rush past when I was younger. Then came winter. It arrived one night without warning, a whisper of snow toning the world to lace. I woke to find the lake glazed over, a mirror of white and blue. The cold brought with it a silence so complete it almost hummed. Those months were slow and tender. I spent them by the fire, reading old letters I'd found in a box beneath the stays, some from my grandmother, some from Thomas. His handwriting had grown shaky over the years, but his words were steady. He had written once, "If you ever come back, look to the lake. I'll be there in the way it moves." I must have read that line 100 times. Winter passed gently. By February, the ice began to crack, the sound echoing across the hills like low thunder. Then, one morning, the first drop of water broke free, a small ripple returning to the surface. It felt like watching the world take its first breath again. Spring followed with its quiet miracles, green creeping up through the soil, the faint sweetness of lilac on the wind. I planted a few things in the garden. Not much, just enough to make the place feel alive. A patch of wildflowers by the fence, tomatoes near the steps. The birds came back, and with them, the sound of mornings. By the time summer returned, it felt as though I'd lived a lifetime within a single year. The lake glimmered again, full of laughter that wasn't there but somehow still was. I spent long evenings sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies blink to life. Neighbors I hadn't seen in decades began stopping by, the Millers from across the cove, old Mr. Jacobs who still ran the hardware store in town. They seemed surprised to see me, but in that kind of small-town way where surprise is just another word for memory. We'd sit together, swapping stories about people who'd gone, places that had changed, and moments that still felt like yesterday. I began to understand something I never had before. That time doesn't really take from us. It transforms what we've known into something softer, something that stays. By the next autumn, the house felt like it had been waiting for me all along. I started painting again, little watercolors of the lake at different hours. Dawn in gold, noon in silver, dusk in blue. I wasn't any good at it, but that wasn't the point. Each stroke felt like a conversation with the past, a way of saying, "I still remember." Years began to pass quietly that way, one folding into the next. The hair at my temples turned gray, then white. The garden grew wilder. The porch swing sagged a little more each spring. But my heart grew lighter, not heavier. Sometimes I'd still hear echoes, not words anymore, but something deeper, like the hush of belonging. It came in the rustle of leaves, in the soft murmur of water beneath the dock. And every so often, On those rare afternoons when rain swept across the lake, I'd step outside and let it fall against my face, warm and gentle, like an old hand resting on my cheek. That's how time moves when you stop trying to hold it. Not in years or days, but in the quiet rhythm of seasons passing. And through them all, the lake stayed, remembering everything that had ever been loved here. There comes a day when you realize that life is not something you can ever hold on to, only something you can touch gently as it passes through your hands. For me, that day came one afternoon in late September. The air had that soft golden weight it always does when summer is finally letting go. The lake was calm, a sheet of pale light. The porch boards were warm beneath my feet. I was sitting with a cup of tea, watching the sun slant across the water, when it struck me how quiet everything had become. Not empty, just settled. It wasn't that the years had taken from me. It was that they had refined what mattered. The noise of the world had softened into something simple. It's funny, when you're young, you think love is something bright and burning, something that sweeps you up and spins you around. But when you've lived long enough, you learn that love is actually what stays when everything else quiets down. It's in the way a chair creaks in the same rhythm it always has. In the smell of a sweater that still holds the faintest trace of someone gone. In the way the rain remembers the sound of their voice. I've learned that time doesn't take the people we love away from us. It just changes the way we keep them. When I was younger, I thought remembering would hurt forever. Now I see that memory is not meant to be a wound. It's meant to be a bridge. Each thought, each smell, each sound that returns is not grief. It's grace. It's the world reminding us that nothing beautiful ever truly leaves. That's one of time's quiet mercies. It teaches you how to listen. There's a rhythm to life you only hear when you stop rushing. The first sound of rain on the roof. The long sigh of wind through the trees. The soft click of a door that's been opened 1,000 times. When you finally learn to hear those small things, you realize that they're the language of everything sacred. That afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, I thought of all the people who had passed through my life. My grandmother with her hands that always smelled of flour and soap. My father and his patient silences. Thomas with his laughter that carried like light. I used to think their stories ended when they left. But sitting there, I understood something new. Maybe we carry their stories forward simply by living in a way that honors them. Every time I plant the garden, I hear my grandmother's voice telling me to water the roots, not the leaves. Every time I fix a squeaky hinge, I hear my father humming under his breath. And when I sit by the lake as the day fades, I hear Thomas laughing from somewhere beyond the horizon. It's all still here, not in the same form, but in the same heart. I've come to believe that growing older isn't about losing things. It's about learning what you are meant to keep. Some nights, I look at the stars and think about how many of them are already gone, their light still traveling toward us across time. And yet, we still see them. We still make wishes on them. Maybe that's what love is. Light from something long ago that never stopped shining. The rain came again that evening, soft and warm. I left the door open, let the sound fill the house. The scent of wet earth drifted in, mingling with the faint sweetness of the tea. I thought about how many rains this porch had seen, how many summers, how many goodbyes, how many small beginnings. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to chase meaning. I just sat there, letting it all be. The water, the light, the memory, the quiet. Time had taught me that peace isn't something you find. It's something that finds you, once you've stopped running long enough to be still. The world outside glowed in shades of silver and gray. I could almost hear the rain murmuring to the lake, the same old conversation they'd been having since the beginning of time. And I thought, maybe that's all any of us are meant to do. To love, to lose, to remember, and to keep whispering back to the world in our own small way. It was a mild afternoon in late spring when I saw the car turn down the old gravel road. I wasn't expecting anyone. Visitors had become rare out here, the kind of place most people pass in their memory long before they ever pass it in person again. The tires crunched softly over the stones, and when the engine stilled, I felt that familiar flutter, a mix of curiosity and something like hope. The door opened, and for a moment, the sunlight caught the figure just right, and I knew. It was Lily, Thomas's daughter. She was grown now, maybe in her 40s, with the same calm eyes he had. The last time I'd seen her, she was a child chasing fireflies by the dock. her laughter ringing out across the water. She had her mother's grace, but when she smiled, I saw the whole of him in her face. She said softly, as if stepping into sacred space. I hope it's all right that I came. Of course, I said. You found it. She looked around, at the porch, the lake, the tall birches standing like sentinels. I wasn't sure it would still be here, she said. It's held on. I smiled. Some things do. We sat on the porch for a while, talking in that gentle, unhurried way that people do when the years between them are thick with memory. She told me about her life, 2 grown children, a small house outside of town, a job she liked. She spoke of Thomas, too, how he talked about the lake even in his later years, how he told her stories of the summer that never seemed to end. She paused then, eyes soft. He said this place changed him, she whispered. I looked out over the water. The light shimmered just like it always had, patient, forgiving. It changed both of us, I said. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, the edges worn and yellowed. I found this in his desk after he passed, she said, her voice gentle. It's addressed to you. I thought, you should have it. My fingers trembled slightly as I took it. The handwriting was unmistakable, steady, deliberate, the loops of his letters like a quiet kind of music. I didn't open it right away. We just sat there, side by side, the sound of the lake filling the spaces between words. It felt as though the years had folded in on themselves, time drawing a neat line between what was and what still is. When she finally stood to leave, she lingered at the steps. He'd be glad you're here, she said. He always hoped you'd come back. I smiled. I think he knew I would. After she drove away, the road settled back into silence. The envelope felt heavy in my hand, not from its weight, but from everything it carried. I took it inside, sat at the kitchen table, and opened it carefully. The paper was thin and yellowed. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. If you're reading this, it means you came back. I hope the lake is as you remember it, stubbornly beautiful, always watching, always waiting. I want you to know that those summers were the best of my life, not because of the lake or the days, but because of you. You made the world feel simple again. If you ever wonder whether what we had mattered, it did. It always did. And if the rain still falls there, listen closely. It carries everything we never needed to say. For a long while, I couldn't move. The tears that came weren't heavy or sharp. They were soft, like mist. The kind that leaves warmth behind instead of sorrow. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest, right over the place where I could still feel my heartbeat steady and sure. Then I walked outside. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that promises rain. I sat on the porch swing, the letter resting in my lap, and watched the clouds drift over the lake. The first drops came slow, cool against my skin. And then it rained, the kind of steady, patient rain that remembers. For a moment, I thought I could almost hear him in it. Not his voice exactly, but the comfort of knowing he had never really gone. I closed my eyes and whispered, I got your letter. The rain fell harder then, as if the world itself was answering back. That evening, when the rain finally stopped, the world looked new again. The lake was still, glass smooth, catching the faint shimmer of twilight. The air smelled of damp earth and lilacs, and the porch boards beneath my feet felt warm from the day's last breath of sun. It was one of those quiet hours when time seems to pause, and everything, the wind, the water, even the heart, takes a gentle rest. I'd left the letter from Thomas on the table beside me. It didn't need to be read again. Every word had already settled into memory, the way rain seeps into soil. I watched the sky fade from blue to rose to gray, and I thought about how many nights I'd sat here before, waiting for something I couldn't quite name. When I was younger, maybe it was love. Later, perhaps it was forgiveness. But now I think it's peace I've been waiting for. The porch light flickered softly to life as dusk deepened. I hadn't turned it on myself. It was one of those old motion lights that the wind could set off. But for some reason, it felt like an old friend's hand on my shoulder. Steady. Familiar. I remembered Thomas standing under that same light all those years ago, his face half-shadowed, rain glinting on his hair. He had said something then, something simple, that I'd long forgotten until that very moment. No matter how far you go, there'll always be a light on somewhere for you. I smiled at the memory. It was such a small promise, really, but one that had survived everything else. The rain had left tiny silver puddles across the yard, and as the night insects began their song, I could hear the world stitching itself back together. Crickets in the tall grass, the soft whisper of the trees, the lake breathing quietly in the distance. I thought about Lily, how she had carried her father's kindness in the way she looked at the world. I hoped she knew that she brought something back with her that day. Not just a letter, but a piece of him, a piece of youth, a reminder that love, even when it changes shape, never really disappears. I rose and walked to the edge of the porch. The boards creaked softly beneath me, the same sound they'd made 50 years ago. I stood there a long while, watching the light sway with the breeze, painting faint gold across the puddles. It struck me, then, how much of life is made up of moments like this, small, quiet, unremarkable moments that end up holding the entire weight of who we are. Not the grand gestures, not the days we think we'll remember, but these, the evenings when the rain has passed, and you realize you're still here. I thought of the letter again, of Thomas, of all the summers that had come and gone. I think I understand now, I said aloud, softly, what the rain remembered. The porch light hummed quietly, its glow spilling out into the night. It didn't chase the darkness away. It never had. But it didn't need to. It simply shone, steadfast and unafraid, reminding anyone passing by that there was warmth here still. And somehow, that was enough. I sat back down, the wood cool beneath my hands, and let the night fold itself around me. The lake's surface rippled once, then stilled again, holding the reflection of the house, the porch, the chair, the light that refused to go out. It wasn't loneliness I felt then. It was something deeper, the quiet grace of having loved and being loved, and finding that even after all the years, that light was still burning. The stars began to appear, faint and slow. I reached over and turned the porch light off for the night. But even as darkness took the place of its glow, I could still see it in my mind, steady and golden. Some lights, I think, never really go out. Night has a sound all its own, not silence exactly, but something softer, a low hum, a tender stillness that wraps itself around everything that's come before. I sat there long after the stars had risen, their reflections trembling gently on the lake's skin. The old porch chair swayed beneath me, the kind of motion that happens without thought, like breathing. The air had cooled, carrying the faint sweetness of honeysuckle. From somewhere across the water, a single frog called out, slow, deliberate, patient. It reminded me of the rhythm of my own heartbeat, steady and unhurried. Inside, the house was quiet. Dust motes drifted in the thin light spilling from a kitchen window. The clock on the wall ticked with that old familiar sound, the same one that had marked time here since before I was born. It struck me how little, and how much, this place had changed. The wallpaper had faded, the floors had creaked more, and yet the feeling of home had never left. Even after people did. Even after seasons turned. I thought of everyone who had ever sat on this porch. Thomas, Mama, Lily when she was small, even the neighbor boys who used to chase lightning bugs through the yard. I could almost see them all there again in the glow of memory, like old photographs fluttering in the wind. Funny thing about memories, they don't fade so much as they settle. They become part of the air, the wood, the sound of rain on the roof. And the rain, yes, the rain had remembered it all. Every laugh, every promise, every quiet goodbye. It had carried them through the years and left them here for me to find again, drop by drop. I closed my eyes for a moment. The night pressed close, cool and kind. When I opened them, the moon had climbed higher, casting silver light across the yard. The lake shimmered faintly, and the shadows of the pines reached long and thin toward the water's edge. I thought about the letter, about the way Thomas's words had felt, not as something lost, but as something returned, like a tide coming home. There was peace in that. I leaned back and let my hands rest on the arms of the chair. The wood was smooth from years of touch, years of stories told in coffee cups set down and lives unfolding slowly on this very porch. It made me wonder how many evenings a person gets, truly gets, in a lifetime. Not the kind that flash by, busy and full, but the ones where time finally loosens its grip and lets you just be. Maybe only a handful, I thought. And maybe that's enough. The world felt wide and quiet, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to hold on to anything. I whispered a thank you to the rain, to the house, to every soul who'd ever shared this little corner of earth with me, to all the days that had passed, and to the few still waiting somewhere ahead. There was no sadness in it, only gratitude. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, and the smell of the lake drifted closer, cool, clean, familiar. The kind of smell that stays with you long after you've gone inside. I looked out over the water one last time before turning in. The porch light was off, but the memory of it glowed in my chest, steady and warm. As I rose, the boards beneath my feet sighed softly, as if the house itself was saying good night. I paused at the door, one hand on the frame, and looked back at the porch. The chair, the railing, the dark stretch of sky beyond. It all felt suspended in that perfect, tender moment between what was and what is. Good night, I said quietly. To the lake, to the rain, to the years that had made me who I am. And then, with a small smile, I stepped inside. The door closed gently behind me, and the night went on. Calm, unbroken, eternal. Outside, the rain began again, light and rhythmic. Not a storm this time, just a memory falling softly back to earth. And in that quiet, endless sound, the story rested.